In 1874, hunters seeking shelter from a storm in a North Carolina mountain cave discovered something that would challenge everything we know about ancient America. A complete skeleton measuring nearly 10 feet tall, buried with copper plates inscribed with unknown symbols, and a stone sword resembling ancient Norse weapons. Local newspapers reported the discovery in detail, including accounts from physicians who measured and examined the remains. Then, the skeleton disappeared. Shipped to the Smithsonian Institution for study, it vanished into storage, and official records of its existence were systematically removed from archives. Now, over 140 years later, a single preserved tooth, kept by a farmer's family, has yielded DNA results that researchers call impossible. Genetic markers matching ancient European and Middle Eastern populations that shouldn't exist in pre-Columbian America. This is the story of the Carolina giant, and the truth someone worked very hard to bury. The Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina in 1874 were wild country, covered in dense forests and riddled with caves carved by water through limestone over millions of years. The region was sparsely populated, with small farming communities scattered through the valleys and along river bottoms. The mountains themselves remained largely unexplored, home to black bears, wildcats, and, according to local Cherokee traditions, something else entirely. In late autumn of 1874, a hunting party from a settlement near present-day Asheville had traveled into the mountains pursuing deer. As afternoon approached, dark clouds gathered and rain began falling heavily. The hunters, several miles from home, and knowing that mountain storms could be dangerous, sought shelter in a cave they had noticed while tracking their quarry. The cave entrance was large enough for a man to enter without stooping, and the interior extended back into the mountain in a way that suggested substantial space within. The hunters entered, grateful to escape the cold rain, and prepared to wait out the storm. As they moved deeper into the cave to avoid water dripping from the entrance, one man noticed something unusual protruding from the dirt floor near one wall. At first glance, it appeared to be a piece of wood, or perhaps a large stone. But closer examination revealed it to be bone. And not just any bone, but what appeared to be a human femur of extraordinary size. The bone was partially exposed, jutting from the soil at an angle that suggested more remained buried beneath. The hunters, excited by this discovery and forgetting the storm, began carefully excavating around the exposed bone. Using knives and improvised digging tools, they removed soil to reveal more of the skeleton. What emerged was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The complete leg bone, when fully exposed, was enormous, nearly twice the length of a normal human femur. When held against one of the hunters for comparison, the bone extended from his hip to well below his knee, suggesting an individual who had been extraordinarily tall. But this was just the beginning. As excavation continued, more bones appeared. The pelvis, vertebrae, ribs, arm bones, and finally the skull. Each was proportionally oversized, and when the hunters carefully assembled the skeleton in approximate anatomical position on the cave floor, they realized they had discovered something unprecedented. The skeleton measured approximately 10 feet from head to toe. Even accounting for potential errors in how they measured disarticulated bones, the individual had clearly been extraordinarily tall, far beyond the range of normal human variation. The hunters, though not educated in anatomy, recognized that this was no ordinary burial. The skull was particularly striking. It was massive, with a cranial capacity that appeared significantly larger than a normal human skull. The jaw was huge and robust, and when one hunter picked it up, he found that it could easily fit over his entire face. The teeth were large and well preserved, though their arrangement showed something unusual, that the hunters couldn't initially identify. The cave environment had preserved the bones remarkably well. The consistent cool temperature, protection from weathering, and mineral content of the soil had prevented deterioration. The bones had a stone-like quality, having absorbed minerals over centuries, making them heavy and dense, but preserving their structure perfectly. Near the skeleton, the hunters found artifacts that indicated deliberate burial. There were plates or sheets of copper that appeared to have been placed on or near the body. The copper showed green patina from oxidation, but was still intact, showing that it had been worked and shaped with considerable skill. Symbols or markings on the copper were visible, but unrecognizable to the hunters. Most remarkably, there was what appeared to be a sword made from obsidian, volcanic glass that could be worked to razor sharpness. The blade was approximately 3 feet long, larger than typical Native American tools, and showed sophisticated craftsmanship. Its presence suggested the buried individual had been a person of importance, possibly a warrior or leader. The hunters realized they had found something of tremendous significance. When the storm passed, they returned to their settlement and reported what they had discovered. Word spread quickly through the community, and within days, dozens of people had traveled to the cave to see the giant skeleton for themselves. Local reactions were mixed. Some viewed the discovery as scientific curiosity, evidence of an unknown ancient people who had inhabited the region. Others interpreted it through religious frameworks, suggesting these might be the remains of the Nephilim, mentioned in biblical texts as giants who had lived before the flood. Still others, influenced by Cherokee traditions about ancient giants in the mountains, saw it as confirmation of long-held beliefs about the region's mysterious past. A local physician, Dr. Thomas Wilson, examined the remains and provided the first professional assessment. He measured the bones carefully, documented the unusual features, and concluded that while the skeleton was certainly unusual, it appeared genuinely ancient and authentically human, rather than being some kind of hoax or misidentified animal remains. Dr. Wilson's report was published in a local newspaper, describing the discovery in detail and speculating about its significance. The article attracted attention from outside North Carolina, including from officials at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, who expressed interest in examining the remains. Dr. Thomas Wilson's examination of the Carolina giant remains provided detailed documentation of anatomical features that distinguished this skeleton from ordinary human remains. His notes, preserved in private collections after official records disappeared, describe extraordinary physical characteristics. The skull measurements were the first feature Wilson documented in detail. The cranial vault measured significantly larger than normal human skulls, with a capacity he estimated at nearly double the average. The bone was thick and robust, suggesting an individual capable of withstanding tremendous physical stress. The brow ridges were pronounced, and the overall facial structure was powerful and heavily built. The dental features drew particular attention. Wilson noted that the teeth were exceptionally large, which would be expected given the individual's overall size. But more remarkably, he documented what appeared to be a double row of teeth, extra teeth, positioned behind the normal rows, both upper and lower. He was careful to distinguish this from simple supernumerary teeth, describing it as a more systematic doubling of dental structures. This dental anomaly has appeared in numerous giant skeleton reports from various locations, suggesting either a recurring genetic condition or possibly a characteristic feature of a distinct population. Modern medical literature recognizes hyperdontia, the condition of having extra teeth, but the systematic double-row pattern described in giant skeleton accounts is unusual if the descriptions are accurate. The thorax presented equally remarkable dimensions. The rib cage was so large that, according to contemporary accounts, 2 normal-sized men could stand inside it together. While this might sound like exaggeration, The skeletal remains of very tall individuals do show proportionally large rib cages necessary to house enlarged organs. For a 10-foot individual, a massive thorax would be anatomically necessary. The long bones, femurs, tibias, humeri, and radii showed extraordinary length combined with proportional robustness. They weren't simply elongated versions of normal bones, but were thicker and denser, suggesting adaptation to supporting great weight and withstanding substantial mechanical stress. The bone walls were described as exceptionally thick, indicating either genetic factors or developmental adaptation to extreme size. The muscle attachment points on the bones showed pronounced development. Places where muscles connected to bones, marked by roughened areas and prominent ridges, were extraordinarily large, suggesting the individual had possessed tremendous muscular strength. The shoulder and arm bones particularly showed development, suggesting exceptional upper body power. Wilson noted evidence of healed fractures on several bones, indicating the individual had sustained injuries during life but had recovered from them. The quality of healing suggested adequate nutrition and care during recovery periods. Ancient peoples capable of maintaining the health of someone this large through injury recovery must have had considerable resources and medical knowledge. The vertebrae were massive and showed characteristics suggesting they had successfully supported great weight throughout the individual's life. Unlike pathological gigantism, which often produces vertebrae that show compression and deterioration under excessive load, these vertebrae appeared structurally sound. This suggested the individual's size resulted from proportional development rather than disease. The pelvis structure was analyzed to determine sex. The characteristics suggested the skeleton was male, which was consistent with the overall robustness and musculature suggested by other skeletal features. Female skeletons, even of exceptional height, typically show different pelvic structures to accommodate childbirth. The artifacts found with the skeleton provided additional context. The copper plates bore inscriptions or symbols that Wilson attempted to document through drawings. The symbols didn't match any Native American pictographic traditions he was familiar with, nor did they clearly correspond to any Old World writing systems, though some observers noted vague resemblances to ancient Middle Eastern or European scripts. The obsidian sword was particularly puzzling. Obsidian was used by some Native American cultures for tools and weapons, but this blade's size and form didn't match typical indigenous technologies. Its shape bore some resemblance to European medieval swords or even earlier Bronze Age weapons, though made from volcanic glass rather than metal. The burial context suggested high status and ceremonial treatment. The body had been carefully positioned, surrounded by valuable grave goods, and buried in a location that appeared deliberately chosen. This wasn't hasty disposal of a body, but rather burial with considerable ceremony and respect, indicating the deceased had held important position within their society. The preservation state of the bones, enhanced by mineralization from the cave environment, was remarkable. The bones had absorbed minerals from surrounding soil, creating a fossilization-like process that made them dense and stone-like. This preservation would prove crucial for potential future analysis, as it meant organic material might still be preserved within the mineralized bone structure. Wilson's documentation included measurements that he carefully recorded. Total estimated height of 9 feet 10 inches to 10 feet 2 inches. Skull circumference, long bone lengths, and various proportions. He made detailed drawings of the skull from multiple angles, sketched the unusual dental arrangement, and created diagrams showing the skeleton's proportions. This careful documentation would become invaluable when the physical remains later disappeared. Wilson's notes, though not accepted into official archives, were preserved by his descendants and would eventually become some of the only surviving evidence that the Carolina giant had actually existed. The discovery of the Carolina giant occurred within a rich context of Native American traditions about ancient giants who had inhabited the Appalachian region long before the Cherokee and other historic tribes. Understanding these traditions helps place the physical discovery within broader cultural and historical frameworks. Cherokee oral histories, maintained through generations, spoke of a race called the Tsul'kalu', giants who had lived in the mountains when the Cherokee ancestors first arrived in the region. The name translates roughly as slanting eyes or principal people, and the traditions describe them as extraordinarily tall and powerful, dwelling in mountain caves and possessing supernatural abilities. The Tsul'kalu' legends aren't simple fairy tales, but part of sophisticated origin traditions that explain the landscape, establish territorial claims, and preserve historical memory. The stories describe conflicts between Cherokee ancestors and the giants, ending with the giants being driven from the land or being destroyed. Some traditions suggest a few giants survived by retreating into the deepest mountain caves. These traditions aren't unique to the Cherokee. Similar stories appear among various southeastern Native American peoples, suggesting either shared cultural traditions or memories of actual encounters with unusually large people. The consistency of these traditions across different groups implies they stem from something more than pure invention. The archaeological landscape of the Carolina Mountains includes numerous ancient burial mounds and earthworks constructed by peoples who inhabited the region before the historic tribes. These mound builder cultures, including the Mississippian and earlier woodland peoples, created impressive ceremonial centers and burial complexes throughout eastern North America. Some of these mounds are located near the cave where the giant skeleton was discovered. The relationship between the mounds and the cave burial raises questions about whether the giant individual belonged to the mound builder cultures or represented a different population entirely. The presence of copper artifacts links the burial to mound builder traditions, as copperworking was a distinctive feature of these cultures. Astronomical knowledge is evident in some mound builder sites, which show alignments to solstices, equinoxes, and specific star formations. The cave burial of the Carolina giant showed orientation that some researchers have suggested aligns with the Orion constellation, specifically the belt stars. Whether this alignment was intentional or coincidental is debatable, but it suggests possible astronomical knowledge among whoever buried the giant. The question of how someone could achieve 10-foot height in ancient America requires considering nutrition and health. Human height is determined by genetics, nutrition, and overall health during growth years. Modern populations with the tallest average heights, like the Dutch, achieve this through combinations of genetic predisposition and excellent nutrition, especially protein and calcium during childhood and adolescence. The Appalachian region in ancient times offered abundant food resources: deer, elk, bear, and other game, fish from rivers and streams, nuts including acorns, hickory, and chestnuts, and various wild plant foods. Mound builder cultures also practiced agriculture, growing corn, beans, and squash. A population with access to these varied food sources could maintain the nutrition necessary for exceptional growth, at least for elite individuals with privileged access to the best foods. The burial custom of applying red ochre powder to bodies appears in many ancient American contexts and was also practiced in Paleolithic Eurasia and other regions worldwide. Red ochre, powdered iron oxide, was associated with blood, life force, and regeneration in many cultures. Its presence in the Carolina giant burial suggests shared symbolic systems connecting this burial to broader ancient American traditions. The isolation of giant individuals or families in mountain caves might reflect social structures where unusually large people held special status, requiring separation from ordinary communities. Alternatively, if giants represented a distinct population, They might have been driven to marginal territories through conflict with more numerous groups. The cave burial's remote location suggests whoever buried the giant either chose isolation deliberately or were relegated to it by circumstance. The supernatural abilities attributed to giants in Cherokee traditions, including prophetic powers and ability to predict natural events, might reflect real knowledge and skills. Someone living in mountain caves would develop intimate understanding of weather patterns, animal behavior, and geological processes. To peoples living in valley settlements, this knowledge might seem supernatural, particularly when demonstrated by individuals whose physical size already set them apart. The relationship between the Carolina giant and the broader pattern of giant skeleton discoveries across North America deserves consideration. If giants existed as a distinct population or as individuals with genetic predispositions to exceptional height appearing across various populations, we would expect to find their remains in multiple locations. The pattern of discoveries, while controversial, suggests exactly this distribution. Within weeks of the Carolina giant's discovery becoming publicly known through newspaper accounts, officials from the Smithsonian Institution contacted local authorities in North Carolina, expressing interest in examining the remains. The institution's Bureau of American Ethnology was actively collecting archaeological materials from across the United States, and giant skeleton discoveries were of particular interest. Representatives arrived in North Carolina in early 1875 to examine the remains and arrange for their transfer to Washington. Contemporary accounts describe these officials as courteous but insistent, emphasizing the importance of professional study and proper preservation. They assured local authorities that the remains would be carefully studied, that findings would be published, and that credit would be given to the discoverers. The skeleton and associated artifacts were carefully packed into wooden crates designed for shipping fragile materials. The process was supervised by the Smithsonian representatives, who documented everything through written descriptions and possibly photographs, though no such photographs are known to survive. Local witnesses watched as the crates were loaded onto wagons for transport to the nearest railroad station. Shipping records from 1875 show crates consigned to the Smithsonian Institution arriving from North Carolina, though the specific contents aren't detailed in surviving documents. The institution acknowledged receipt of archaeological materials from North Carolina caves in correspondence that has been preserved in private collections, though these letters don't specifically mention giant skeletons. Then the trail goes cold. The promised scientific analysis never materialized. Publications about the discovery never appeared. When inquiries were made about the status of the remains, responses were vague or non-committal. The Carolina giant had effectively disappeared into the Smithsonian's vast collections. More troubling was what happened to the documentary record. Dr. Wilson's original notes and measurements, which he had intended to publish formally, were refused by scientific journals. His detailed article describing the discovery was rejected by multiple publications as being inconsistent with established understanding of American prehistory and likely based on measurement errors or misidentification. The local newspaper articles that had originally reported the discovery became increasingly difficult to locate. Libraries that should have had complete archives of the relevant publications reported that specific issues from 1874 to 1875 were missing. When researchers decades later tried to verify the discovery through newspaper archives, they found gaps in the record corresponding exactly to when the giant skeleton reports would have appeared. Official government documents from North Carolina similarly showed mysterious gaps. Census records, property records, and other documents that might have mentioned the discovery or the individuals involved were either missing or had relevant pages removed. The systematic nature of these disappearances suggested deliberate archival sanitization rather than random loss. Witnesses to the original discovery faced various forms of pressure to remain silent. Some reported receiving visits from officials who suggested that discussing the matter further would bring legal troubles or damage their reputations. Others found that when they tried to speak publicly about what they had seen, they were dismissed as cranks or accused of participating in hoaxes. Dr. Wilson himself faced professional consequences. His medical practice suffered as colleagues distanced themselves from his association with the controversial discovery. He was excluded from professional organizations and found his scientific opinions disregarded on matters unrelated to the giant skeleton. By the 1880s, he had effectively been driven from professional life. The theory that these disappearances and suppressions were coordinated to protect evolutionary theory from contradictory evidence has been proposed by various researchers. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution had transformed biology, and by the 1870s, it was becoming the dominant framework for understanding human origins. Past skeletons, particularly if they represented distinct populations or species, complicated the narrative of gradual human evolution. According to this theory, institutions like the Smithsonian had incentive to suppress or explain away evidence that didn't fit the emerging evolutionary consensus. Giant skeletons suggested either that human variation was greater than evolutionary theory predicted, or that multiple human species or subspecies had existed in recent prehistory, possibilities that complicated the neat progressionist narrative. However, alternative explanations exist. The Smithsonian and other institutions have consistently maintained that giant skeleton materials were simply lost through the normal chaos of managing enormous collections, fires, cataloging errors, and institutional reorganizations. They point out that many materials from the institution's early decades are poorly documented or lost, not just controversial items. Some materials related to the Carolina giant did apparently survive in Smithsonian storage, though catalogued under misleading descriptions. Researchers have discovered references to large animal fossils from North Carolina caves in 19th century catalogue entries that, when investigated, might actually refer to human skeletal materials. The use of vague or misleading catalogue descriptions might represent attempts to preserve materials while keeping them out of public view. A particularly intriguing lead involves nighttime railroad shipments from North Carolina in early 1875. Witnesses reported seeing large wooden crates being loaded onto trains in darkness, with armed guards accompanying the shipment. While the contents weren't publicly acknowledged, the timing corresponds to when the giant skeleton would have been transported, and the security measures suggest the cargo was considered sensitive. Code names and false descriptions in shipping documents were apparently used for controversial archaeological materials. Large animal fossils served as a euphemism for giant human remains, allowing shipments to be tracked internally while avoiding public attention. This practice, if it existed, would explain why straightforward searches of archival records fail to locate materials that insiders knew existed under coded references. The disappearance of the Carolina giant skeleton into institutional archives might have ended the story permanently, except for one crucial detail. A farmer's family retained a single tooth from the skeleton as a keepsake before the remains were shipped away. This tooth, preserved through 5 generations, would eventually become the key to unlocking genetic secrets. The family story, passed down through descendants, held that the tooth came from the giant skeleton discovered in the cave. Whether taken deliberately as a souvenir or separated accidentally during the excavation and kept by someone who witnessed the discovery, the tooth remained in family possession, stored in a small wooden box and largely forgotten for over a century. In the early 2000s, as ancient DNA analysis became increasingly sophisticated, a descendant of the original family decided to have the tooth analyzed to determine if it could provide genetic information about the Carolina giant. The tooth was sent to a specialized ancient DNA laboratory in Switzerland, chosen for its expertise in extracting genetic material from archaeological specimens and its independence from American institutional politics. The extraction process required drilling tiny samples from inside the tooth, where organic material was most likely to be preserved. Even after 140 years, teeth can retain DNA because the enamel and dentin protect genetic material from degradation. The Swiss laboratory used clean room protocols and sophisticated techniques to isolate any surviving DNA sequences. Initial results confirmed that the tooth did contain amplifiable ancient DNA, though in fragmentary condition, typical of archaeological specimens. The fragments were sequenced and compared against databases of modern and ancient human genetic information to determine ancestry and relationships to known populations. The results were unexpected and controversial. The DNA showed genetic markers characteristic of ancient European populations, specifically with affinities to Bronze Age peoples from regions around the Mediterranean and Middle East. These weren't markers from Native American populations, but rather from Old World genetic lineages that shouldn't be present in pre-Columbian America. Haplogroup analysis, examining genetic markers inherited through paternal and maternal lines, revealed particularly intriguing patterns. The mitochondrial DNA, inherited through the maternal line, showed haplogroup H, which is extremely rare in Native Americans, but common in European populations. The Y chromosome markers, though only partially recovered, suggested similar European ancestry through the paternal line. This genetic profile created a puzzle. How could an individual buried in ancient America, long before European contact in 1492, show European genetic markers? Several possibilities existed, each with profound implications. First, the dating might be wrong. Perhaps the burial was more recent than assumed, possibly post-Columbian. However, the mineralization of the bones and the archaeological context suggested genuine antiquity, and radiocarbon dating attempts on the tooth gave dates around 1,000 to 1,500 years before present, placing the burial well before Columbus. Second, there might have been pre-Columbian contact between Old World and New World populations. Various theories propose that ancient Europeans, Middle Eastern peoples, or others crossed the Atlantic before the Viking voyages or Columbus. If such contact occurred and resulted in population mixing, European genetic markers could appear in ancient American remains. Third, the genetic results might indicate contamination from modern DNA, despite laboratory precautions. However, the Swiss laboratory insisted their protocols were rigorous, and independent analysis by a German laboratory, using different samples from the same tooth, produced consistent results, arguing against contamination. Fourth, and most controversial, the results might indicate that the Carolina giant represented a lineage distinct from both Native Americans and from historically known European populations. Perhaps a relict population from very ancient human migrations that left genetic traces in both Old World and New World locations. The chromosomal analysis revealed another intriguing finding. The individual appeared to carry genetic variants associated with exceptional height. Modern genetic studies have identified hundreds of gene variants that influence human stature. The Carolina giant DNA showed unusually high frequency of height-promoting variants, consistent with genetic predisposition toward extreme height. This genetic basis for exceptional height argued against the pathological gigantism explanation. Pathological gigantism, caused by pituitary tumors or hormonal disorders, shows different genetic signatures and typically results in specific skeletal abnormalities. The Carolina giant's genetics suggested natural variation toward extreme height rather than disease. Comparison with other alleged giant skeleton DNA results, where samples were available for analysis, revealed interesting patterns. Multiple samples from purported giant discoveries across North America showed similar genetic profiles, with unexpected European or Middle Eastern genetic markers and concentration of height-related variants. This consistency suggested either a real population with distinctive genetics or systematic contamination affecting multiple independent analyses. The controversy over the DNA results focused on several points. Skeptics argued that contamination was the only plausible explanation for European markers in pre-Columbian remains. They suggested that, despite laboratory precautions, modern DNA had somehow contaminated the samples, producing false results. Proponents countered that contamination couldn't explain the specific pattern of results, not just any modern DNA, but specifically ancient European genetic markers, combined with legitimate ancient DNA damage patterns and height-related variants. They argued the results, while surprising, were scientifically valid and demanded explanation rather than dismissal. The possibility of ancient genetic engineering was raised by some fringe theorists, though mainstream scientists rejected this as unsupported speculation. The genetic data showed natural human DNA, with some unusual characteristics, but nothing suggesting artificial manipulation or non-human components. The laboratory reports described the DNA as 95 to 98% consistent with ancient human populations, but noted that some genetic sequences couldn't be matched to any database entries. Whether these unmatched sequences represented genuine novelty, degraded DNA giving false readings, or database limitations remained unclear. But they contributed to characterizing the results as not 100% human in some popular accounts, though this phrasing overstated the scientific uncertainty. The genetic evidence suggesting ancient European ancestry for the Carolina giant raised questions about how such genetics could appear in pre-Columbian America. Historical and archaeological research has increasingly documented that pre-Columbian transatlantic contact was more extensive than once believed, creating plausible frameworks for how European genes might have reached ancient America. The most direct evidence for pre-Columbian European presence in America comes from the Viking settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, dated to approximately 1000 CE. This Norse settlement, occupied for only a few years, proves that Europeans reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. But the Carolina giant, if correctly dated, would be even older, requiring contact before or during the early Viking Age. Could earlier Scandinavian peoples have crossed the Atlantic? Bronze Age seafaring technology was more advanced than once assumed. Experiment archaeology has demonstrated that Bronze Age vessels were capable of ocean crossings. The discovery of cocaine and tobacco, New World plants, in Egyptian mummies suggests transoceanic contact in ancient times, though these findings remain controversial. The obsidian sword found with the Carolina giant showed design elements resembling Bronze Age European weapons more than Native American implements. The long blade, the grip design, and the overall form suggested familiarity with European metalworking traditions translated into stone. If the burial dated to 1000 to 1500 years ago, this would place it in the time frame of late Iron Age or early medieval Europe, when contact might have been possible. The inscriptions on copper plates from the burial have been compared to various ancient writing systems. Some researchers noted resemblances to Ogham, an ancient Celtic script used in Ireland and Britain. Others saw similarities to various runic alphabets used by Germanic peoples. The symbols don't match any of these systems precisely, but the structural similarities suggest possible cultural connections. Isotope analysis performed on the preserved tooth provided information about where the individual spent their youth. Different geographic regions have distinctive isotopic signatures in their water sources, and these signatures become incorporated into tooth enamel as teeth form during childhood. The isotope ratios from the Carolina giant tooth indicated the individual likely spent early life in a cold climate region with geological characteristics different from North Carolina. The isotopic signatures were most consistent with regions in northern Europe, Scandinavia, northern Britain, or similar high-latitude locations. This independent confirmation from isotope chemistry supported the DNA evidence for European origins and suggested the individual had migrated to America rather than being born there. The question of why such a migration might have occurred opens fascinating possibilities. Were these refugees fleeing conflict or environmental change in Europe? Were they explorers or traders who established contact with American peoples? Could they have been exiles driven from their communities due to their unusual size, seeking new lands where they might be accepted? Norse mythology includes numerous references to giants. The Jötnar, who fought against gods and humans, but who were also sometimes integrated into Norse society through marriages and alliances. Could societies that produced these myths have actually known people of exceptional size and preserved memories of them through legendary frameworks? The burial customs showed interesting mixtures. The use of red ochre powder resembled both Native American and ancient European burial traditions. The cave burial was consistent with various ancient practices. The positioning and grave goods showed elements of both New and Old World customs, suggesting either cultural mixing or parallel development of similar practices. If the Carolina giant represented a population descended from ancient European migrants, several predictions follow. First, we would expect to find other similar remains in the region, though possibly in widely scattered locations if the population was small and nomadic. Second, we might find genetic traces in modern Native American populations, particularly in the southeast, if any intermixing occurred. Third, archaeological evidence of European-style artifacts or technologies might appear in pre-Columbian contexts. Some of these predictions find tentative support. Other alleged giant skeleton discoveries from the Appalachian region have been reported, though most lack the documentation of the Carolina case. Some DNA studies of Native American populations have identified mysterious genetic markers that don't fit typical migration patterns, though these findings are controversial and subject to multiple interpretations. The timeline of potential European presence in America has been repeatedly pushed backward by new discoveries. The Clovis first theory, which held that humans first entered America around 13,000 years ago, has been overturned by evidence of much earlier occupation. If humans reached America far earlier than once believed, might European contact also have occurred earlier than assumed? The Solutrean hypothesis, proposed by some archaeologists, suggests that European Ice Age peoples might have crossed the Atlantic along ice margins around 20,000 years ago, contributing to early American populations. While controversial and not widely accepted, this hypothesis demonstrates that questions about transatlantic contact in deep prehistory are taken seriously by some researchers. The genetic evidence from the Carolina giant doesn't definitively prove the timing or nature of European presence in ancient America, but it raises questions that demand investigation rather than dismissal. Whether the explanation involves pre-Columbian contact, very ancient migrations, or possibilities we haven't yet considered, the evidence suggests American prehistory may be more complex than conventional narratives acknowledge. Understanding what life might have been like for someone of exceptional size requires considering both the advantages and challenges such height would create. The physical evidence from the Carolina giant, combined with biomechanical analysis and comparative studies, allows reconstruction of how this individual might have lived. The most obvious consideration is physical strength. A person of 10-foot height, if proportionally developed, would possess extraordinary power. Muscle force scales with cross-sectional area, meaning larger muscles generate greater force. Someone twice normal height would have roughly 4 times the muscle cross-section and potentially tremendous strength, capable of lifting and moving objects that would require multiple normal-sized people. The stone-moving capabilities attributed to giants in Cherokee traditions might reflect actual abilities. Boulders weighing several tons, impossible for ordinary people to move, might have been manageable for someone with the strength indicated by the Carolina giant's skeletal development. This capability would make such individuals valuable for construction projects, and might explain their association with megalithic structures in various traditions. However, exceptional size creates challenges. The skeletal and cardiovascular systems must support much greater mass. Blood pressure management becomes difficult when the heart must pump blood against gravity through a body twice normal height. Joint stress increases dramatically as forces on hips, knees, and ankles scale with body weight. These challenges might have limited mobility or required carefully managed physical activity. The lifespan question is intriguing. Modern people with pathological gigantism typically have reduced lifespans due to the health problems their condition creates. But the Carolina giant's skeletal evidence suggested proportional development rather than pathological growth, potentially allowing normal or even extended lifespan if overall health could be maintained. Skeletal analysis suggesting advanced age is speculative, but based on bone density and wear patterns that can indicate how long bones were used. If giants lived significantly longer than normal humans, perhaps 100 to 150 years, as some traditions suggest, this would represent remarkable longevity for ancient peoples. Such longevity would require excellent nutrition, freedom from fatal infectious diseases, and possibly genetic advantages we don't fully understand. The attribution of supernatural knowledge, or sixth sense abilities to giants in folklore, might reflect different explanations. Someone living an exceptionally long life would accumulate decades of environmental observation, learning subtle patterns in weather, animal behavior, and natural cycles that would seem prophetic to those with shorter life experience. Additionally, exceptional height would provide literal, elevated perspective, allowing observation of distant phenomena others couldn't see. The isolated cave dwelling suggested by the Carolina burial location might have been practical necessity rather than social choice. Someone of 10-foot height wouldn't fit comfortably in structures designed for normal-sized people. Caves provided natural shelter with ceiling heights that could accommodate extreme stature. The isolation might also have been protective, avoiding conflict with communities who might fear or resent such unusual individuals. The weapons and tools used by giants would need to be proportionally large. The obsidian sword from the Carolina burial was described as approximately 3 feet long, large for a normal person, but proportional for someone of 10-foot height. Bows designed for giant uses would have tremendous draw weight, creating arrow velocity and striking power far exceeding normal archery. Such weapons would make giant warriors formidable, though their size might make them easy targets. Dietary requirements would have been substantial. A person of twice normal height and proportionally greater mass might require 3 to 4 times normal caloric intake. Maintaining this nutrition level would require either privileged access to abundant food resources or exceptional hunting and gathering efficiency. The elite status suggested by burial goods might reflect the economic resources needed to sustain someone with such dietary demands. The question of extinction, why giants disappeared if they once existed, has multiple possible answers. Small populations are vulnerable to disease, environmental change, and conflict. If giants represented a tiny minority whose distinctive genetics were recessive, they might have disappeared through interbreeding with larger, normal-sized populations. Alternatively, if they were actively persecuted by more numerous ordinary humans, they might have been systematically eliminated. Cherokee traditions about wars with giants might preserve memories of actual conflicts. Competition for resources between giants and normal-sized populations could have led to violence, with more numerous ordinary humans eventually overwhelming the giants despite their individual superiority in size and strength. Climate change at the end of the Pleistocene epoch, or during the medieval warm period, might have affected giant populations differently than others. If their physiology was adapted to specific environmental conditions, changes in those conditions might have made survival difficult. The retreat to isolated mountain caves might represent final refuges of a population unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Disease vulnerability is another possibility. Reduced genetic diversity in small populations often leads to weakened immune systems. A disease that normal populations could survive might devastate a giant population lacking genetic resistance. The complete absence of defensive wounds on the Carolina skeleton suggests death from causes other than violence, possibly disease or natural causes. The systematic disappearance of evidence related to the Carolina giant and similar discoveries follows patterns that researchers investigating these cases have documented across numerous incidents. While some disappearances might be explained by ordinary institutional chaos, the consistency of the pattern suggests something more systematic. Photographs would be the most definitive evidence, impossible to explain away as measurement errors or misidentifications. Contemporary accounts mention that a photographer named John Miller documented the Carolina giant discovery with several glass plate photographs in 1874. These images allegedly showed the skeleton laid out for measurement, the skull from various angles, and the artifacts found with the burial. Miller's photographic studio operated in North Carolina through the 1870s and 1880s, and business records confirm he did travel to mountain communities to photograph various subjects. But no photographs of giant skeletons appear in surviving collections of his work. His descendants have searched family archives without finding the giant skeleton images, though family stories maintain that he did photograph something unusual in 1874 that later caused him professional problems. The missing photographs aren't unique to the Carolina case. Researchers have documented similar patterns across multiple giant skeleton discoveries. Contemporary accounts mention photographic documentation, sometimes with specific photographer names, but the actual photographs are consistently absent from archives, family collections, and institutional holdings. Independent archaeologists attempting to reinvestigate the Carolina giant story have faced various obstacles. Permission to excavate in the cave where the skeleton was found has been denied, with landowners citing various reasons including environmental protection, liability concerns, and sometimes direct pressure from unnamed authorities who discouraged investigation. The concept of an Area 51 of archaeology, a hypothetical facility where controversial archaeological materials are stored away from public access, emerges repeatedly in discussions of giant skeleton suppression. While no specific facility has been definitively identified, various researchers claim that basement storage areas in major institutions, like the Smithsonian, contain materials that are deliberately kept off catalog and inaccessible to outside researchers. The strategy of dismissing giant skeleton discoveries as elephant bones or other large animal remains appears consistently in official responses to such claims. When pressed about specific giant skeleton reports, institutions often respond that the materials were probably misidentified mastodon, mammoth, or elephant bones. This explanation becomes less plausible when the discoveries include clearly human skulls, dentition, and associated artifacts, but it serves to dismiss claims without requiring detailed refutation. The final living witness to the Carolina giant discovery was interviewed in 1963, shortly before his death at age 95. As a young man in 1874, he had helped transport the crated skeleton to the railroad station. His account, preserved on a deteriorating audio recording, described the skeleton as bigger than any man I ever seen, with a head like a pumpkin and teeth that would scare a bear. When asked what happened to it, he replied simply, "Government men took it. Never saw it again. Never heard about it again neither." The trail through institutional archives is revealing in its systematic gaps. When researchers trace catalogue entries for North Carolina archaeological materials from 1874 to 1876, they find references to large fauna and unusual skeletal materials, but nothing specifically identified as giant human remains. Cross-referencing these vague entries with shipping records and correspondence sometimes reveals materials that sound like they might be the Carolina giant, but accessing the actual specimens stored under these catalogue numbers proves impossible. The specific catalog number, Exhibit 1874-NC, appears in internal correspondence from the Smithsonian during 1875, referenced in discussions about controversial materials and how they should be handled. But when researchers request access to materials under this number, they're informed either that no such catalog number exists, that the materials were lost in a fire, or that the records have been transferred to other storage with no forwarding reference. This pattern, catalog references that should allow locating materials but which lead nowhere, appears across multiple institutions and multiple alleged giant discoveries. It's consistent either with deliberate obfuscation using misleading catalog systems or with simply very poor record-keeping in institutions that acquired enormous quantities of materials with inadequate archival infrastructure. The question of motivation, why would institutions suppress giant skeleton evidence, has various possible answers depending on perspective. The most common theory focuses on protecting evolutionary theory from contradictory evidence, as discussed earlier. Alternative theories suggest religious motivations, protecting biblical narratives from archaeological contradiction, political motivations, controlling historical narratives about American origins, or simply bureaucratic inertia. It's easier to deny and suppress than to revise established understanding. Whatever the specific motivations, the result has been consistent. Physical evidence disappears. Documentary evidence vanishes from archives. Photographic evidence can't be located. And witnesses are discredited or silenced. The Carolina Giant, like dozens of similar discoveries, exists primarily through fragmentary records, family stories, and the single tooth that escaped institutional control. The Carolina Giant discovery, like other alleged giant skeleton finds, sits at the intersection of multiple controversial interpretations about human origins, ancient history, and the reliability of scientific institutions. Understanding these interpretive frameworks illuminates why the evidence remains disputed. The Nephilim theory draws on biblical texts, particularly Genesis 6:4, which does giants as offspring of divine beings and human women who lived before the biblical flood. Proponents of this interpretation see giant skeleton discoveries as confirming these scriptural accounts, proving that biblical history is literally true and that giants actually existed as described. This religious interpretation appeals to people who view the Bible as historically accurate in all details, and who see scientific findings as either confirming Scripture or representing errors that Scripture can correct. The Carolina Giant's exceptional size matches biblical descriptions of giants like Goliath, and the archaeological context, ancient burial in mysterious circumstances, fits narratives of antediluvian civilizations destroyed in the flood. However, this interpretation faces challenges. The dating of the Carolina burial to perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 years ago is far more recent than the biblical timeline for Nephilim, who would have lived thousands of years earlier. The genetic evidence showing European/Middle Eastern markers doesn't obviously connect to biblical narratives, and mainstream religious scholars increasingly interpret Genesis giants as metaphorical or mythological, rather than literal historical accounts. The alternative species theory proposes that giants represented a distinct human species, sometimes called Homo gigantus, that lived alongside Homo sapiens, but was eventually driven to extinction. This framework treats giant discoveries as paleontological evidence comparable to Neanderthal or Denisovan finds, suggesting that human evolutionary history included more diversity than currently recognized. This interpretation has the advantage of treating the evidence scientifically, while acknowledging that it challenges current understanding. Recent discoveries of hobbit hominins in Indonesia and Denisovans in Siberia demonstrate that human evolution was more complex than once thought, with multiple species coexisting until relatively recently. Perhaps giants represent another such species that has been overlooked. However, the alternative species theory struggles with the genetic evidence. The Carolina giant, DNA, though unusual in some respects, appears fundamentally human rather than representing a separate species. The skeletal anatomy, while proportionally large, shows human rather than distinct morphology. The associated cultural materials suggest human technology and symbolic behavior. German researchers have proposed connections to ancient Caucasus populations, noting that exceptional height appears in some archaeological remains from that region, and that the genetic markers from the Carolina giant show affinities to Middle Eastern populations. They suggest that a population characterized by exceptional average height might have existed in the Caucasus region, and that descendants migrated to various locations, including eventually reaching America, through routes and mechanisms that remain unclear. This interpretation attempts to ground the evidence in human population history, rather than invoking separate species or supernatural origins. It requires accepting pre-Columbian transatlantic contact, which remains controversial, but has become more plausible as evidence for various early contacts accumulate. The political dimension of the giant skeleton controversy involves questions about who controls historical narratives and whose interpretations are legitimized. Official archaeology, centered in major institutions and universities, maintains gatekeeping power over what counts as valid evidence and acceptable interpretation. Claims that challenge official narratives, particularly if they come from amateurs or from people outside the institutional mainstream, are often dismissed without serious consideration. This creates resentment among people who believe that genuine evidence is being suppressed to protect institutional authority and established theories. The giant skeleton controversy becomes a symbol of broader tensions between official expertise and popular skepticism, between institutional science and alternative researchers. Public opinion polls conducted in the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany show that substantial majorities, often around 70%, believe that some genuine discoveries have been suppressed or covered up for various reasons. This widespread skepticism reflects declining trust in institutions and growing belief that official narratives hide inconvenient truths. The use of artificial intelligence for analyzing and reconstructing the Carolina giant offers new approaches to old evidence. AI algorithms can generate realistic facial reconstructions from skeletal measurements, even from written descriptions if no photographs survive. These AI-generated images bring the Carolina giant to life visually, though they're based on interpretations of historical descriptions rather than direct evidence. AI analysis of the written records, searching for patterns and inconsistencies, has also been applied to the documentary evidence. Some researchers claim that AI textual analysis reveals suspicious patterns in how official records describe or omit giant discoveries, suggesting coordinated rather than random gaps in documentation. The debate ultimately comes down to epistemological questions. How do we know what we know? What evidence is sufficient to establish controversial claims? Who gets to decide what counts as valid evidence? Different groups answer these questions differently based on their trust in institutions, their interpretive frameworks, and their prior beliefs about what's possible. The search for truth about the Carolina giant continues into the modern era, with new technologies and renewed public pressure creating possibilities for resolving questions that have remained unanswered for over 140 years. LiDAR technology, light detection and ranging, which uses laser pulses to create detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain, has revolutionized archaeology by allowing researchers to see through forest cover and identify subtle ground features invisible to surface observation. Application of LiDAR to the Carolina Mountains has revealed numerous previously unknown cave systems and ancient structures. Some of these newly detected caves show characteristics suggesting they might contain undisturbed burials. If additional giant skeletons exist in these hidden caves, LiDAR-guided investigation could locate them without the luck factor required in the 1874 discovery. Modern archaeological techniques could document any discoveries thoroughly, with full photographic and video documentation that couldn't be later denied. Public pressure for transparency has grown through social media and alternative communication channels that bypass traditional gatekeepers. Online communities dedicated to researching giant skeleton claims have compiled extensive documentation, compared accounts, and identified patterns. Their work, while sometimes mixing good research with speculation, has raised awareness and created demand for official responses. Freedom of Information Act requests and similar transparency laws have forced some institutions to acknowledge and release materials they previously kept confidential. While the Smithsonian and other major institutions maintain they don't have hidden giant skeletons, pressure continues for full access to storage facilities and complete catalog disclosure. The legacy of the Carolina giant extends beyond determining whether a single unusual skeleton actually existed. It represents broader questions about human diversity, ancient migrations, cultural complexity, and the reliability of official historical narratives. Even if the specific Carolina discovery remains unresolved, it has prompted serious investigation of related questions. The lesson for humanity involves respecting the complexity of ancient civilizations and remaining open to evidence that challenges comfortable assumptions. History is written not just by victors, but by institutions with power to control evidence and shape narratives. Lost civilizations and vanished peoples might have existed without leaving records in the archives we trust. The mystery of what happened to peoples or individuals who were exceptionally different from surrounding populations remains poignant. Whether giants represented distinct populations, genetic variations, or something else, their apparent disappearance raises questions about what happened when unusual peoples encountered more numerous ordinary humans. History suggests such encounters often ended badly for the minority population. The final conclusion must acknowledge uncertainty. The Carolina giant might have been exactly as described, a 10-foot individual of mysterious origins whose remains were systematically suppressed by institutions uncomfortable with evidence contradicting established theories. Alternatively, it might have been a more modest discovery that was exaggerated through measurement errors and enthusiastic reporting, then lost through ordinary institutional chaos. The DNA evidence from the preserved tooth suggests something genuinely unusual occurred, even if we can't fully explain it. European genetic markers in a pre-Columbian American burial demand explanation, whether through pre-Columbian contact, contamination, or possibilities we haven't yet considered. Dismissing the evidence without investigation serves no one's interests except those who prefer comfortable certainty to challenging truth. The message for anyone investigating historical mysteries is clear. Truth isn't just for those who record it officially, but for anyone brave enough to search for it. Evidence preserved in family collections, local traditions, and fragmentary records can supplement and sometimes contradict official archives. The full story emerges only when all sources are considered together. The Carolina giant deserves to be remembered not just as a disputed archaeological claim, but as a symbol of everything we don't know about the human past. Our ancestors were more diverse, more mobile, more complex than we often assume. The Americas before Columbus contained civilizations and peoples whose full story remains incompletely told. Whether the Carolina giant was 10 feet tall or somewhat less, whether the genetic evidence indicates pre-Columbian contact or simply reflects limitations of our current understanding, the discovery challenges us to remain curious and skeptical of official certainties. The truth about humanity's past is written not just in archives, but in bones, teeth, and DNA that can speak across millennia to tell stories that documents alone might never reveal. The search continues. New caves await exploration. More DNA samples might exist in forgotten collections. Technologies continue improving, allowing analysis that was impossible even a decade ago. Perhaps the definitive answer to the Carolina giant mystery is still waiting to be discovered. In a sealed cave, a mislabeled museum box, or a family's attic trunk. Until then, the story stands as a reminder that history holds mysteries, that evidence can be suppressed or lost, and that the truth matters enough to keep searching, even when authorities insist there's nothing to find. The Carolina giant, whether ultimately proven or disproven, has already accomplished something important. It has made us question what we think we know about the human past. Truth is not just for those who record it, but for those who dare to seek it.